So welcome everyone to our first session of positioning anti-racism in higher education. And I was coming up with a kind of a general theme for this event and what will become a series shortly, which I'll talk through in a moment. I wanted to think about it as a constructive, disruptive space to think about where are we at with anti-racist practice and action, where have we been and where can we go forward? And I think the positioning aspect is really, really important. And we're going to talk through with different themes and issues around that more broadly as well. So thank you all for joining us. And what I wanted to do before we kind of get into the conversation is set a bit of a definition which we'll use to interrogate and discuss and see where we are more broadly. And this definition comes from the Anti-Racism in Higher Education, an Action Guide for Change book, which was published in 2022. And some of the co-authors are here, which is exciting. And some of the peer reviewers of the group are here as well. And one of the things I wanted to think about is how far have we come since 2020, since 2022, and how far do we need to go to keep positioning anti-racism in higher education, and what outcomes it could yield as well more broadly. So it's a really, I think, a timely conversation to be having as momentum is starting to dip in some way, shape or form, but we will unpack that in a moment as well. So what I would like to share is a bit of a definition of what does it mean to be anti-racist. And I'm just going to read this quote out. So it's recognizing that when a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic colleague is subject to a racial injustice, that they will be supported and empowered to challenge the status quo. To be anti-racist is to be truly intersectional and to be stronger in solidarity to those that live with multiple intersecting disadvantages, inequalities, and oppressions. To be anti-racist is to be able to practice care and compassion with yourself and others. Being anti-racist offers a holistic model to driving equity, equality, diversity, and inclusion across one of the most influential sectors in today's society. And I do believe that higher education is hugely transformative for communities as well. I think it's absolutely critical in this space. So I'm really, really excited to be able to be joined by two wonderful speakers. And I'm going to do some introductions and we'll dive into the conversation as well. So the first speaker is Benita Odogwu Atkinson, who's been an educator for over 30 years, delivering fashion and creative industries curriculums both in further education and in higher education. Currently a senior lecturer at the University of the Creative Arts, co-chair of Fashion Academics Creating Equality, or by the appropriate acronym FACE, academic trustee, graduate Fashion Foundation, BFC Colleges committee member, and UCA academic board member. Benita has also presented at several academic panel events on racism, equity, and inclusion in higher education, and panel discussions at multiple universities, run workshops on inclusive teaching and lectures in Europe on social justice. Benita also remains a fashion design practitioner. And also, secondly, a really warm welcome as well to Jitesh Gajjar, is currently professor of applied mathematics at the University of Manchester. He attained his undergraduate and PhD degrees from Imperial College, then worked as a research scientist at BMT Ltd before taking up a lecturing post at Exeter University in 1985. He moved to Manchester in 1991. His research expertise is in fluid mechanics, and he has published extensively, including co-authoring parts 1 and 4 of Fluid Dynamics, published by Oxford University Press, and was also a contributor to the governance chapter of the Anti-Racism in Higher Education book as well. So already, between the three of us, we've got a range of skill. And for those that don't know, my name is Dr Arun Verma. I'm editor of the Anti-Racism in Higher Education book, and currently I'm head of inclusion at the University of London as well. So, I want to spend more time discussing the issues and themes. And so the first question I have is for Benita, if that's okay. So Benita, it's been nearly about 4 years since the momentum was created through the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020. What progress or impact has been made in empowering higher education to becoming anti-racist?
I think initially, and leading on from the death of George Floyd, which none of us could practically avoid because we were it was in communications or to be done internally within universities. Since that initial rush, I feel there's been a slowdown. I think there was no actual requirement anywhere for further work to be done or for that work to carry on. I think, the idea, I feel that if, looking at racism and those questions are being asked and are part of, for example, the NSS, I think there would be a different outcome in terms of universities being more focused. I think what we found is that the anti-racism becomes embedded within EDI, which sometimes can become so general that it doesn't focus on particular aspects of like racism, where it actually needs a particular focus. So I feel that we have stalled and it's slightly slower. Some universities, and I have to say, because I have seen it, are making good strides, but in general, it appears to be almost entwined with decolonization, and for some, there's almost a fatigue.
Thanks, Benita. I think you raised some really valid points. And I think one of the things I find really interesting is also the connection or the interconnection that's being made between the acronym of EDI and anti-racism. And I just wondered, there's a bit of a debate about whether or not equality, diversity, and inclusion work is really anti-racist. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on why it's
Um,
important to separate, or what is the connection?
I mean, there is a connection in that EDI is, well, I always think it's the wrong way around, because unless you have inclusivity and diversity, you can't have equality. And that becomes very general. But I think in terms of talking about anti-racism, I think it's a very particular subject area, particular experience for Black and Brown people, that it needs a special focus. So it needs supports particular groups in the way it should do.
Thanks, Benita. I think the signal's a little bit broken, but it's okay. We are catching
Okay.
some
Sorry.
catching what we say. That's okay. These things happen. So I guess then one of the things you kind of raised was around the action. The momentum has slowed down in universities to some degree. It's actually quite interesting. One of the things I recall seeing on a particular institution, I won't name names, but on one university, they claimed that they are already an anti-racist institution. And I found that quite fascinating. And I wondered if I'm fairly confident they're not anti-racist as an institution, but I thought it was really interesting the way in which it's been marketed as that it's been done, in some way, shape, or form, and so I guess there's a bit of a disconnect between what's being said and what's being done, and it just brings me on to thinking about actions. And a lot of the words and the ways in which universities use the term anti-racism, and are they actually putting those principles, those values, some things that I've just raised from that definition I said earlier, to making change, and adding to knowledge where possible? What are your thoughts in terms of like the kind of actions universities are not taking or could be taking, and any thoughts from you from there?
I think that the missing part, and I think we have wonderful rhetoric, we have the academic aspect of talking about anti-racism, but what we often don't have is the follow-on in terms of accountability and actually following up on a consistent basis. Because for a university to say that it's now anti-racist, well, the cohort changes every year, so how can that be a continuum? You cannot say you are, because a university is made up of the people that come in. And also, if your structures, and if you look at your structures properly, you will find that there are constraints in there, which sometimes is based on race. So you can't say in that respect you are. So I think the universities need to know that they want to know what is going on there. They need to take accountability into practice, and most importantly, they need to act on their findings and not just do the digital exercises that as academic staff we have to do every year or every 3 years, because what does that actually do?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to think of it that way. And I think one of the key things is that when you start looking at things like your data through a sort of racial justice lens, it really does change your approach. And often that can be seen as sort of prioritizing one inequality over another, and that's not necessarily the case, because any anti-racist work has to be intersectional. That's kind of it's always has to be there, and I think that's really really important as well. That most inequalities have a racialized aspect to them, and when you start to find those that experience double and triple discrimination, there is evidence, and then the Black Leadership Group have evidenced this as well in their various reports on how racial minorities within different inequalities are still marginalized in some way, shape, or form, and that the actions and interventions and the way in which you look at the data can be scaled for more inclusive systems and institutions. I think there's some really interesting kind of ways in which you can look at the data and look at the evidence to make actions. I just one of the things you kind of mentioned really broadly was about accountability, and I just wondered from your perspective, Anita, what does accountability mean to you? And I just wondered if you could share your thoughts on it, because I find we can use it a lot in this space, and I just wanted to see, for me, it means that kind of taking ownership, responsibility, making informed decisions. But I just want to sense check from your perspective if you had any reflections on it in relation to race equality work more broadly.
For me, it's starting from the point of accepting that there is racism, because so often there are discussions around things have changed and moved on so much that actually do you really need to be doing this work? Yeah. We're now in the 21st century. So it's about accepting that there is, or potentially is, racism within your institution. How do you then seek to find that out? And when you do find this out, what do you do with that information? So it's really being much more aware, and I think universities, and this is not sort of playing to that, oh, it's my specialist lane, and I don't see anything wrong with that. But it's also how it's structured within EDI departments, who focuses on what. And do you have specialists who actually are there to seek and develop aspects of work that actually is finding out and then acting on? And once you've acted on, what are the outcomes and what do you do with it all? So it's really important that there is an acceptance of racism in the first place. Yep. And that's a starting point for me.
Yeah, and I that's a really important point as well, because one of the things around this is being honest about the nature of racism in an higher education system is the place to start. It's not necessarily a failure on one person. It's to kind of acknowledge it and then move forward with it. So yes, I think that's really important. Jitesh, did you want to come in and share some questions?
It's that point about institutions accepting racism exists, and I've been in Senate meetings where a member sort of gets up and says, looking at the data and so on, this tells you that there's institutional racism going on. And immediately, one after another, many of the senior leaders will jump up and down saying, no, we are not institutionally racist, and so on and so on. So that point, in a university like mine, it sort of rouses so many emotional sort of feelings, and to be labeled racist or institutionally racist, and for the outside world to know that, that has huge sort of implications, doesn't it? So, and people don't like that. So, it's actually being honest, as you said, in accepting what the situation is, and then actually promoting actions and behaviors which are going to try and change that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think one of the key things, and when we talk about the notion of institutional racism, the label itself is highly contested, but actually the meaning of it is relatively well evidenced in different spaces. If you take the definition of it as being collective failure, and that's one of the key parts of that particular definition. So yeah, so that ownership that there's a problem, acknowledging that there's a problem. And Kimberly Crenshaw says this in a very great talk of hers on a TED talk, which she says, if you can't name a problem, you can't solve it. And I think this is where we are. We saw that there was a naming of the problem, about 4 years ago, roughly. But we're not. I don't know if we're very closer to solving it or getting closer to solutions, and that's one of the key parts. We've talked a little bit, kind of at a more sector level and of course, or strategic level in some ways around positioning anti-racism. And Jitesh, I just wanted to ask you, because around particular issues that face universities, and one of the major ones, or two of the major ones, are on widening participation and awarding gaps. That's where we see a lot kind of work happening in universities, and also, under regulatory requirements as well, of course. So I wondered if you had any thoughts or reflections on where anti-racism could play a role in helping improve or enhance initiatives around widening participation and awarding gaps, and if you had any reflections and thoughts on that.
First of all, let's think about the widening sort of or the attainment gap, because that's been there for many years. We've been collecting data year in, year out. We've been publishing in institutionally in these applications, REC charter applications, and so on. And we look at the terms which are used there. It's unexplained gap, unexplained. But after so many years, it's still unexplained. So what's happening? Isn't there any initiative to try and explain why we are getting this? We have so much data around, and this is where I think slowly I was looking at my institution, which it managed to get a silver award in the REC this year. So I was looking at the action plans, how they're addressing this particular sort of issue in terms of trying to, they talk about eliminating the degree attainment gap in a few years' time. And so what are the actions which, certainly my institution is doing, and maybe what other institutions are trying to do. In a sense, the progress is going to be slow, because you are faced with lots of issues. These are structural issues, processes, and so on, which can inhibit progress in many respects. If you think about how, when you look at the degree, grades are discussed, allocated, etc. Everything now is anonymous, certainly in many institutions I know. So there's no, you can't, basically tie in the certain groups are maybe on the borderline, could be pushed up or so, with if you wanted to try and help in that way. So you can't help at that sort of level. So where is that help actually coming from? And this is where I think there's quite a lot of research in the US where they've done this, certainly for STEM subjects. I was looking at a recent article on that, and they talk about what are the things which influence positive outcomes for people from BME type backgrounds entering STEM courses in higher education. And there's things like supplemental learning programs, mentorship, so peer mentorship, skill building, financial aid scholarships. There's something called bridging programs, socializing. And in a sense, in the UK, I think we've been really quite slow to pick up even one or two of these themes, and things like sort of bridge building. So this is people, when the students enter the university, they're all supposed to have very similar grades, 3 A's or 2 A's and a B or so on. So you think that maybe they come from a similar sort of background, but actually their before the university level education influences how they've learned, what sort of skills they've picked up, and so on. And that influences the progress as they go through. And so there's quite a lot which can be done to try and support groups in particular areas who are coming in, to try and get them up to a sort of a skills level which can help them cope better. And so I think some of these activities are slowly being recognized, and I can see happening in my sort of institution. Things like supplemental learning. So there, if you start talking about introducing, these sort of ideas, then there's a lot of opposition as well, because people will say, well, you are supporting one group of students, why not much bigger cohort and so on. And that's fine. I mean, you can, if you can target support towards a much bigger cohort, hopefully that will also help the group of students that we're also trying to help in maybe getting that additional sort of knowledge and skills base. But then you run into the deficit type model, and but in a subject like maths, actually, if you don't have the background knowledge, then it inhibits you as you go further and further ahead in a sort of degree program. So you do need to have supplemental learning and so on for targeted groups to try and build up that sort of skills base. So some of this type of activity, I think, does need to happen. And to me, the biggest change that I've seen, certainly in my institution, within my own department, and I can think you can probably extend that elsewhere as well, is that when you have a change of leadership at the top, if you have people who are really keen on these issues, then they can go and make the changes happen. And I've seen a transformation certainly in my department in terms of appointments and so on, and some of the things which are slowly happening. It never happened many years ago. Within the wider sort of faculty and so on, well, the same faces are there as leaders and so on. So the progress is sort of stalled in that sort of respect.
Thanks. I'm sorry, Jitesh. Do go ahead if there's points.
I think there's also about widening access, the WP programs. So there's, again, I think each institution has to publish access and widening participation sort of plans. And this is sort of mandated by HESA and so on, because there's a lot of money attached to these sort of initiatives, and trying to increase the number of people from disadvantaged backgrounds entering universities.
Yep.
So the key there is the money. and I think, if you look at, and I think this comes out in certainly some of the things in the book, that where money is a driver, like with the Athena Swan Charter, the research councils insist that these sort of activities should happen. You should do this and this and this, because if you don't, then we will not won't fund your research and so on. The same, I think, sort of money type driven focus can push changes and drive this anti-racist work even more. And if you go back to what happened after all these initiatives started, I mean, it happened because of something which happened across the pond, and a lot of institutions wanted to be, one after another, come out with a statement saying, no, we are trying to do this and this and this, and there was a lot of momentum which was generated, and when you have that momentum, it generates initiatives and work. But I think Benita was right. That work has really stalled in many respects, and you do need people to start raising awareness again and reviving this sort of initiative and so on. Okay.
Thanks for sharing that, Jitesh. There's so much richness in that as well, in terms of actually tangible things that could be implemented to address some of the things that need to be changed. And I think there is something around, there's something interesting around the skills base for addressing and closing the attainment and awarding gap, the skills base for participation or widening participation. We did see, and I remember speaking with individuals that specifically work on closing the awarding gap initiatives across the sector, and there was an anecdotal kind of noticing that the awarding gap was narrowed during the pandemic, but the mechanisms around that were a little bit unclear, and this kind of held with those that were assessing and those that were going through the course and pivoting courses. And so there's things that we could potentially learn, but I think there are specific skills to closing awarding gaps. There's specific skills that students could be gaining, and we could empower students with to also participate in that in some way, shape, or form. So it's really important. Benita, did you want to come in as well?
Yes, what I wanted to say, and I don't think it's controversial, that we within institutions, and especially as academics, we shouldn't necessarily always be waiting for something to come from the top. We as individuals have power to make our spaces anti-racist in ourselves, and quite often the awarding gap is a correlation produced sometimes by those who are doing the teaching and the awarding, and we have to remember that. And that's why I prefer to call it the awarding gap, because the onus isn't just on the student. So I think it's really important that as individuals we remember that we have a certain amount of power and what we can do to change the space, because whether we like it or not, some of the awarding gap is a result of lack of understanding of others. So representation is also important in terms of who you see in front of you sometimes, or in the space you're in. So it's quite multifaceted in trying to create an anti-racist space. That's what I wanted to say.
Thanks for that. And I just want to slightly pivot. We've talked a bit about the student aspect, but I also want to reflect a little bit on the staff, and you've just kind of given us a nice little segue into that, Benita, as well. And one of the things I want to check in on is, universities are a system in themselves. It's like a machine with lots and lots of different moving parts, moving in a direction of some kind, shape, or form. And yes, students are a central, critical part of that, of course. It's centered around, all universities centered around student engagement and students more broadly. But also the staff play a critical role in terms of the student experience, in terms of helping facilitate anti-racism and helping it come to life in some way as well. And I just kind of wanted to, with yourself, Jitesh, just wanted to kind of come to you in terms of, are there any particular challenges that you've kind of could reflect on in relation to where anti-racism is positioned in higher education? Anything from your experience around where staff might lose out, where universities are not taking an anti-racist perspective? So I guess this is actually sort of the cost of it. In some ways, this is the cost of losing staff time or staff well-being, and so on and so forth. So just wondered if you had any reflections on that, Jitesh, and I'll come to you, Benita, as well in a moment.
I mean, there are lots and lots of challenges to being anti-racist. And the first is, it's sticking your neck out and actually speaking out. That is, I think, always requires a lot of courage, and not many people do it, even though behind the scenes they've been experiencing all kinds of difficulties and so on. Because what has happened. You do see people speaking out, and then somehow there are biases in the system, which people remember names when it comes to promotion and other places and so on, and the promotions committees and so on. I again are not very full of people from diverse backgrounds. I think that's a fact. You just have to look around and count how many people there are, and so the people sort of if you want to make it up the ladder in many respects, people are conscious of where the careers might be going and so on, have to somehow be the silenced sort of minority in many respects, and cope and then be accepted as part of the rest of the crowd. So I think that the people who do speak out, and I guess in my case, I reached the pinnacle of my career, and so I'm a bit more vocal and so on. It wasn't like that. I admit it wasn't like that earlier, but I think more recently, yeah, I have been more vocal. But then there are other more junior people who I think do experience these issues. So that's, I think, a fairly important sort of barrier. Other barriers, I mean, to actually get involved in this work, you do need support from people at the top as well, from the leaders. I mean, I think, Benita, you're right that you can't wait for people from the top to tell us what to do. But to start off small initiatives, sometimes you need funding, sometimes you need other colleagues to get involved in doing activities and so on. And so actually, I think with this sort of anti-racist type work, I think it would be nice to have a group of like-minded people asking the right questions, raising awareness and so on, and not feeling threatened to actually make sure that these issues do keep in the sort of a public eye from time to time.
I think that's really, really powerful, and I think these are the conditions for anti-racism to be practiced, to be put into action. But it's also recognizing that it yields such power in terms of developing inclusive cultures so people can bring their voice to the table, that you don't have to get to a certain stage of leadership to say what you feel like you should be able to say. And I think that's the shift that would be nice to have. So we have people joining higher education or coming into higher education that do feel that they can start speaking and saying what is on their mind, obviously within reason to some degree, right? To kind of share their feelings and sentiments about the way the system is and isn't working. So I think that that's a really good point in terms of culture in particular as well. Benita, did you have any particular reflections in relation to that?
Yes, I think obviously from July 2020 and the killing of George Floyd, I think it became the pinnacle of not accepting how things have been. And we formed a group called Fashion Academics Creating Equality, which in the first instance was there to support each other from the experiences we had, even going back to being in school, being students in university, etc. So that support and that support mechanism of Black and Brown academics really has given us all strength to be able to feel we can speak up and say what we feel needs to be said. We also have worked in a way that we've working with universities. So, I've done lots of talks at universities, and we say very challenging things because there's no point dressing over things. The other thing we've done is that we did do a student survey, and students from up and down the country, and they could be white, Black, brown, people of colour, to actually start to tell us what are the experiences of students in relation to race and racism. We have got one coming up in a few months' time, which is called See My Academic Face, so that we can start to gauge what our staff, academic staff and people associated with the university experiencing. Because until you can pinpoint and say to them, this is what we have found out, so often there isn't a listening ear there. But if you can start to say, well, actually, this is what we found, this is what we know, this, then you start to find out. So that support mechanism is really, really important if you're going to travel through that relaying of anti-racist language to be able to try and change things. You need the support of others. And we also have a white associates group because we feel we have to have allies as well. It's not just about us doing it all ourselves, that heavy lifting. So it's really important that there are allies and that we are working, because for me, when I talk about anti-racism within my sessions, it's not just for to support our Black students. It's also about changing the mindsets of our white students. So it's for everybody. So I never see it as something separate to one group. It has to be for everybody in terms of looking at how they operate, especially when they leave university and maybe become bosses, etc., that they start to really think about how the structures have been worked in a way that hasn't supported every race. It hasn't. And they start to understand, actually, that is what structural racism means. That is what institutional racism means. And until you start to really talk about it, how are you going to change anything?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Jitesh, did you want to share anything on what Benita said?
I think having these sort of support networks does help, and being part of a like-minded, not just sort of BME type, but including like-minded people from the department. I mean, yesterday I was having conversations, full and frank conversations with other colleagues, white colleagues, and many of them share these sort of views that we want to become a better department, because it helps. Everybody knows that bringing diverse people in, making giving the opportunities for everybody to achieve and reach their fullest potential is is everybody's interest, really, because it helps the community. You might pick up the one very bright student who you'd never have seen if you hadn't allowed them the opportunities and so on. And we talked about, for example, that there are gaps in offers that we make to postgraduate students to do research compared to white students. And these are coming because students are coming from overseas. And there's a
think we may have lost Jitesh for a moment. And I feel like he was about to make such an important point as well, his final point. So I'm hoping he'll rejoin in a moment, or be able to reconnect. I think there's some really, really incredible points and things that we can all take away, right? So at the end, the work of being anti-racist is about investing in communities. Anti-racism was, and even EDI, as we call it, stemmed from activism and social justice groups marching, protesting for their rights and legislation. And it stems even beyond that, the abolitionist movement that predates the stuff we're doing today over hundreds and hundreds of years as well. So there's the way in which that we've used, that we talk about anti-racism practice is not a new thing. It didn't start in 2020. It's something that started from the abolitionist movement. It started hundreds of years ago, and this is the modernized, work that we're doing. It's the proactive effort to call racial injustice out and create those learning opportunities, create educational opportunities for change to happen, and looking for transformation. When you look at anti-racism as initiatives, is always called for systems change. And you look at the picket, if you look at photos of anti-racist protests, even in the last 100 years, you'll see there's pickets which talk about systems change. And I think that's one of the, or equivalent, maybe in different words, but that's one of the key things that has come through. A lot of systems transformation work has come from that kind of rhetoric and narrative more broadly. So there's a lot there in terms of thinking about the communities we can cultivate and create space for in universities, and then you see if there's ways in which we can empower those groups to be part and to be seen and to be heard as well. And I think that's really, really important, because sometimes we are working in an environment and culture that's not so forgiving. The goalpost to success move. So having community, thinking about channeling bell hooks, his kindness, loving, compassionate spaces are really important to address that as well. Jitesh, we lost you just for a moment, and I believe you're going to come to a really grand point. So I'm just going to give you a moment to share that before I move on to the questions from the group.
Okay, so I wasn't sure whether I ended up doing that, but I was talking about, talking with colleagues where we were discussing, trying to improve the chances of overseas students being, given offers and so on. And we face these barriers because we're trying to compare qualifications from a part of the world which don't translate into the high firsts and others that we might be looking for here. But that doesn't mean that these students from other parts of the world can't actually do the work and who can come out with sort of good outcomes. And so this is where the thinking needs to change in really in how we see people of talent from different backgrounds, and not just looking at the rigid criteria and so on. And so I think there is some work which has to be done, and there is some risk-taking which has to be done in order to try and move this forward. But it can only happen really if you get a like-minded group of people who share these thoughts, and then you're fighting against the system because the university says, no, you can't do this and you can't do that. But if there are many people and you get support of leaders, heads of departments and so on who will sign things off, then you can do these things. But it is a tough battle, but it's not just for us, but it is for other people who also think this way.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And you allude to a point which I read in an article a while ago, this notion of strategic silencing, which is about the positioning of marginalized groups in a way that they cannot be heard. And that is something that can happen quite subversively, not just in universities, but in different organizations. And I think that's also really, really important. It's important to have that community aspect. So thanks for coming back and reconnecting with us to share the big point you had as well. So thank you. We're going to come to some of the questions from the group. If you do have questions, just as a little reminder, there's a little triangle, square, circle icon on the bottom right hand of your screen. And if you click on that, it will take you to a Q&A bit where you can submit your questions and I can approve those and moderate where needed as well. But we've got two in, and I'd like to just kind of tackle the first one, if that's okay. And I might come to you, Benita, if that's all right on this one. So it says, when universities boldly state their anti-racist prowess, is there an avenue to challenge them for evidence of their claims? Is there a way to tell them to prove it or ask for evidence of their anti-racism? Any initial thoughts on what evidence for anti-racism might look like?
I mean, that's a very, very good point, because often you will only get the information that they want you to have. But as we know, there are rules around information, because they would have to actually show what were the matrix, what was the research, what were the outcomes, etc., that they've used to make that statement. So using the same processes that universities have in terms of the way they garner information, you can get the information from them as to how they've arrived at that result. So I think it can and easily be done, because how did they get to it? And I think it's a legitimate question if you're boldly stating that in this day and age.
I think that's the question you can ask. You can ask, what is the evidence you have to showcase that you feel you're an anti-racist institution? And I think then you can have a deeper conversation about what is impact in this space. So keep asking those questions, I think, is probably is a message. But thanks for sharing that, Benita. And then we'll come to the second question, which is, how do you encourage institutions to admit to the problem in the first place and treat the solutions as a priority and not just a tick box exercise? Jitesh, any initial reflections on how we might encourage institutions to take an honest look at their system or their university, and step away from the tick box exercise.
What are the consequences of not doing so, and there are reputational damage, brand image damage, and so on. If these sort of issues, we had issues recently with the senior leader. They were going around making comments which surfaced, and those, once you start making enemies, then people publicize these sort of things, and therefore then people have to backtrack because it becomes very, very embarrassing and so on. Mm-hmm. But actually, I think we have to also point out to institutions that why are we doing this? We have many institutions have what they call socially responsible things as part of their governance and so on. You want to do things which are good for the community and for the society as such. And so surely this should be really core part of our activities, and if it isn't, why not? And so, you do have to try and bring them on board like this, because there are, all these reports. There's a parliamentary report on diversity, inclusion, and STEM. And again, it talks about what diversity brings to the workplace and to society and so on in general, and what are the consequences of not increasing opportunities for people from diverse backgrounds to have the same sort of playing field and so on. So I think slowly it is a matter of time and patience, but you do need to keep persisting and sticking your head out with few others, not just yourself. I think that's the thing.
Thanks, Jitesh. Yeah, I think it's quite. There are some institutions, and I remember in particular, the previous vice chancellor for the University of East Anglia was very public about his views on saying that universities are institutionally racist, and that was very much in the news and things like that. And it's quite something to kind of acknowledge that is the problem, and then you start being able to address the issues, and then you do it in a meaningful way. So you're not just looking at what's on your checklist, but you're thinking about what are the cultures that need to change. How do you bring people and involve people into the space to participate in the change? How do you encourage people to educate themselves and change their practice, rather than going down a list of things and saying everyone in their job description has anti-racism in their job description? That's not going to. It would be nice if it was that easy, but unfortunately it isn't. So there's a few things there which I think are really important, and we are seeing a shift towards culture in higher education, being a bit more focused on what culture is, how it manifests itself, how you change cultures. Particularly with things like the upcoming REF is focused on research cultures and environments. I suspect maybe in the future we'll be talking about teaching cultures and environments more prominently and more explicitly, if we're not already doing that soon as well. So there's quite interesting movements towards culture and behaviour more broadly, which I think is maybe more sustainable in terms of where we'd like to get to too. We got another question through, and I'll just take this last one, which is, what does an anti-racist university look or feel like for a student or staff? I'm assuming none of us are students on the call, so I don't know if we could really speak to that, but I could probably give some indication of what it might feel like for a student, or what the intended outcome might be for students. But I'll just pause there in case Benita or Jitesh, you have any initial reflections on what an anti-racist university might feel like for yourselves.
That's almost looking for the ideal in many ways, which really shouldn't be a question. But for me, it's a university where you feel that you're, as an academic, you feel supported in the process of anti-racism and how you enact it. You also feel, as a Black person or a person of colour, that there are no limitations in terms of your progress, if there are progress. It's also important that you feel in the space you're in, you can bring anything up, actually, and it shouldn't be in a way that you feel, oh, I mustn't talk about race because no one really wants to hear about it. And what we're also fighting against is the way that the media has almost started to entwine elements of EDI and race work with workism. So that's another aspect to now deal with. So it's very difficult, but it's a university with a space that anyone of color feels safe in and able to operate in, and not have to be one person or another to fit in, that you're accepted as you are.
Yeah, I think that's very important, isn't it? That it's a place where you feel valued, whatever background you're from. That you can contribute to the university's policies, agenda, whatever, to the work that is being done and so on, and you feel that your opinion matters, because marginalized groups, somehow the opinion doesn't get taken into account at all. So I think when there's a culture shift and the whole ethos is different, everybody feels happier, and it's a much better place to work in, isn't it? So for me, I think that would be definitely a good place to be in. Yeah.
Thanks for reflecting that. And I think just from my perspective, I think an anti-racist institution is continuously and critically reflective on their approach to social justice, that they're treating and using principles of meaningful compassion and kindness with staff that are burdened on top of their day jobs to do further work in this space as well. And also that we see intersectional representation through different parts of the hierarchy. And I think that's really important. I say intersectional representation because I think it's a matter that we need to see people using their storytelling in leadership positions to connect more with communities and people and places more broadly. That will get us to somewhere closer to an anti-racist institution without me going into a utopia vision of it more broadly, but might get one step a bit closer. I'm just going to address the last question, which is on the Race Equality Charter specifically. And I think just as a note, in terms of the inclusion of real data or real statistics, I think there's one thing about including it in your submission for different accreditations and so forth across the sector, but the most important thing is around whenever you're using these frameworks is how you're implementing it and how you're putting it into practice. A framework is only a framework. If it's not implemented well, the change won't happen. If it's implemented well, you'll see and yield results in some way, shape, or form. So I think it's less about what data you're including in those applications for accreditation or acknowledgement. It's also more important to think about how are you using those statistics to inform actions and change to those that are in charge of making those changes as well. So, and then the acknowledgements will come, the awards and the accreditations will come as you focus on those outcomes. So in terms of, I would encourage those, that are working those applications to think about what goes beyond the award and recognition as well, and how can you use the framework to get the best out of the system you're working in too. I'm going to wrap up there. We have got another question, but we're coming towards the end of this session. I just want to say thank you to everyone that has engaged and listened in and shared their questions. There's going to be the next roundtable event. We'll be looking at specifically the staff experiences, and that speaks to the second chapter within the book. And we're going to deep dive into the different barriers and the challenges and the opportunities really as well that come with looking at an anti-racist staff experience more broadly. And that's really speaking to looking at what staff trajectory could look like. And we get more into the detail on promotional committees and all that kind of stuff as well. So if you're interested in joining that session or participating as a speaker, do feel free to contact me directly, and we can make that happen as well. And do encourage your institutions, if they haven't already, get copies of the Anti-Racism in Higher Education and Action Guide for Change book. It's currently stocked in over 240 libraries across the world. It's making its way around. We're starting to see the citations come through in different spaces. I had one just the other day of an author doing an EDI review and has quoted authors from the book, which is really exciting to see. So do try to engage with the book more broadly as well, because there's lots of questions and opportunities for change there as well. I'd like to also just thank our speakers, Benita and Jitesh. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and contributing to the discussion. And thank you to everyone that joined, and look forward to hearing from you and continuing the conversation in different spaces